Marc Andreessen needs no introduction. He invented the browser. He built the internet, so I'm really excited to have you here.
I apologize for nothing.
All right, so before we get started, you had a really interesting conversation that I wanted to actually start with just a couple of days ago with Lenny. And you were talking about this notion of, in the history of time, when has productivity really spiked? And what's happening right now. So can you just talk a little bit about your perspective on productivity increases that have happened at different phases in time, and where are we today compared to those times?
Yeah, so as everybody probably knows, productivity growth is like the key driver of economic growth. Like it's the thing that actually causes the economy to expand. Economists measure it with something called total factor productivity. They measure it every year. The prevailing kind of myth of the last 50 years, basically my entire life, all of our entire lives, has been that we've been in this era of very rapid technological change, which would necessarily mean very rapid productivity growth. Yet, if you actually look at the statistics, basically since the year I was born, 1971, productivity downshifted hard from prior eras. And productivity growth, basically for the last 50, 55, 60 years, has been at basically historical lows. It's been very low, which is, by the way, why economic growth has been low, which, by the way, is why the national mood has become so focused around, zero-sum economics, populism, the sense that if somebody's getting ahead, somebody else must be getting disadvantaged. If you compare and contrast that to the period between about 1930 to about 1970, productivity growth was roughly twice as fast through that period. And if you compare and contrast that to the period of 1880 through 1930, productivity growth was about 3 times as fast. So we had 3x and then 2x and then 1x. And so this is very not good. Like
Why do you think that is?
Most fundamentally, I think it's because we decided other things are more important, and in particular, in the last, basically since the 1970s, if you just look at the charts of like the number of laws on the books, or the number of pages in the Federal Register, or the number of regulations in the economy, that it's just this like knee in the curve went exponential, which continues. And so we decided we didn't want nuclear power, right? We decided we didn't want a space program. We decided we didn't want cars that went faster than 55. We decided, we just decided we didn't want these things. And so what we got in the last 50 years was like hyper-acceleration in very specifically, basically chips and software. And then what we got was basically, essentially stagnation in everything else. And so like it's really not good. And then but correspondingly, this of the many reasons to be excited about AI, like put it this way: if either the AI optimists are correct or the AI doomsayers are correct, productivity growth is about to go through the roof. So.
And do you think it's like 2 or 3x? Is it 10x? Where do you think it gets to?
So this is always one of these kinds of questions. Like in a like completely deregulated economy, like in sort of Murray Rothbard's like dream of just like straight basically anarcho-capitalism. At least in theory, you could imagine an acceleration to, I don't know, 5%, 10%. I mean, if you believe in kind of either the optimists or the doomsayers, you're looking at such radical, AI representing radical software productivity growth, and then robotics coming right behind, right? And robotics, of course, starting in the form of the self-driving car and the drone, but humanoid robots coming quickly. You could imagine, you could paint, scenarios of 10%, 20%, 30%, something like that. I think in practice, that's unlikely, again, just because like the robots have to agree to all the regulations also, and so there's a lot of things they're not going to be allowed to do. By the way, AI, look, I give you a great example of how this is playing out today. I think if you're just like an ordinary person, I got food poisoning over the holiday. I went on vacation, of course, immediately got sick, which always happens. I got food poisoning, and so I let as an experiment, I let Dr. GPT like walk me through basically every stage of food poisoning, and I kept asking, like, I had nothing else to do because I'm flat on my back, so I just kept asking like more and more detailed questions about my physical experience and what I should do and what I should eat and how I should recover, and like it's just like absolutely incredible. Like it's just like the most amazing, like endlessly patient, sort of infinitely knowledgeable, endlessly caring doctor. It doesn't get like irritated when I have the same question at 4 in the morning, and I'm like, well, could you go into that, a little deeper? And are you sure it's not, pancreatitis? And are you sure I'm not about to die? Oh no, it's okay. You're absolutely fine. And it's just amazing. And then of course, AI cannot be licensed as a doctor. Right, that's like completely illegal, right? You cannot actually have an AI doctor, and so you do have this like basically massive disconnect. And again, I'm not saying I'm advocating for the Murray Rothbard world. I'm not saying rip up all the regulations. I'm just saying like it just factually, objectively,
it slows you down.
Yeah, again, the hyper optimists and the doomsayers are not. Neither one of them are going to get the world that they think that we're going to get. We're going to get something. We're going to get a muddle through the middle thing, which I think, by the way, I think is going to go quite well. But it's going to be a muddle, and there's going to be a lot of tension, kind of between those sides along the way.
And then, given that, where does the value start accreting in the stack most?
So I think this is a really big question. We're professional investors on our side, and so of course we think about this all the time. And I actually think there's still more questions than answers than this, right? Because you can paint this picture that says that the AI model companies are going to basically own everything, and by the way, you look at their businesses and they're doing fantastically well. You can also look at it and say, oh no, that whole thing's going to get eaten by open source, or by the way, or by China, or by a combination of open source in China, which China is doing great. This company, Kimi, just dropped a very competitive model to the latest Claude at 95% the capability at a fraction of the price. And so there's a very big open question there. We happen to be at this moment, what everybody believes, and if you look at NVIDIA's, deserved success over the last 5 years, the reasonable conclusion is chips. All of a sudden, chips is where the action are. There's, if you look at the stock market, there's a rotation from software into hardware. And look, it's possible that chips are it's possible all the value accrues to the chips and the energy, and then the software is all open source. Having said that, every other time in history where we said the chips are where the value are, that they commoditize, right? And so there's big questions there. And then there's even more questions, I would say, at the app layer, right? Which is, are you going to have apps that are going to sort of harness AI, for example, in spaces like medicine, where they're going to be particularly tailored and customized, or legal apps or business apps of all kinds, or are the models just going to do all that? And that's another area. And so I quite honestly this is so new. This approach of, AI is an 80-year-old topic, but AI working in a way where this is the question, I think we're only 3 years into, probably a 30-year shift, and I actually think we don't know yet.
And it seems like the value might accrete for across all of these layers for the foreseeable future, because everything is getting refactored. So you will need to have a lot of infra to power a lot of apps. Those apps are going to get. So what's your take on enterprise SaaS in general and what happens over there? And does that get completely rethought, reimagined, or?
So we're in a baby in a bathwater moment right now. Just look at the stock market. It's just SaaS is just getting demolished. And if you talk to hedge fund managers, they're just selling all their software just under the theory that they just want to get out of the way of the AI freight train. As an investor, you kind of say, okay, that probably is overdoing it a bit. You probably want to look at different kinds of software. And so, for example, in SaaS, my theory, you want to look at systems of record differently than you want to look at basically just productivity applications.
Yep.
So that's one way of looking at it. Also, look, everybody doesn't change their behavior overnight, and so you definitely want to look at loyalty and stickiness in lots of different ways. And then there's this giant question actually, in the tech industry, right, among all the software companies, right, which is okay, if I'm, if I'm Adobe, just to pick an example, Adobe, which is obviously a great company, but a question in front of Adobe that they're working on, but is a very good question, is okay, is Photoshop plus AI features an even better version of Photoshop, or is Photoshop unnecessary in a world in which AI is just making all the images? I think I know smart people who will argue both sides of that, and I think you can I just use that as an example. You can apply that question to kind of every category
in every
of software.
domain.
We in our business are seeing a bunch of software companies that for sure are not moving fast enough to adopt, and we're enthusiastically funding AI-centric startups to go try to take them out. Having said that, we are also now seeing examples of more traditional software companies that have figured out an AI twist to what they're doing, and all of a sudden they've ignited growth. And so I also think we'll probably see a lot of that. And my big conclusion from all this is I think one of the reasons it's so hard to predict or kind of characterize all these things as broad-based trends is that human agency matters a lot, right? And which means leadership matters a lot, which means the CEO, the people building the product, have a vote here at every one of these companies. What do they choose to do in response? And optimistically, hopefully a lot of people will figure out how to have this be a plus and not a minus.
You touched a little bit on open source in China. Talk a little bit more about how that plays out. Does US get to be a dominant player in open source over time? You actually have a front row seat at a lot of the investments that are being made in a lot of these areas. What happens?
Yeah, so it's this,
By the way, what are the implications too? If we don't do well in open source, what does that mean for the US?
Well, I guess you could say, look, maybe start by, because it's like a 2x2 grid. It's like US, China, open source, closed source.
Yep.
Be a rough approximation. So like without open source, just start by saying without open source. Like without open source, there is a two-horse race. There's a two-horse technological geopolitical foot race, which is US versus China. So and again, let's assume it's all proprietary for the moment. And both China has been on record for years in their national their 5-year plans and their national strategy and so forth that like AI is cornerstone technology of the future. The U.S. government, by the way, has been definitive on the record on this in many of its policy areas for the last decade. And both countries' industries are moving incredibly fast on AI. And so I think by default, if everything's proprietary, then there's this race underway, which basically says, and it's really right. It's just practically speaking, it's only happening in the U.S. and Europe, U.S. and China. And so then you basically say that there's a race underway, and the stakes are basically what is the world going to run on, right? What is 8 billion people on the planet? What are they going to use? And one of the ways to think about it is kind of the 5G Huawei, kind of thing that was in the news a lot, a few years ago. It's like that was the preamble opening salvo of what fundamentally is going to be the AI geopolitical, basically race, right? And fundamentally, tech markets being what they are, in the long run, somebody's going to win. And the world will either be running on American AI or be running on Chinese AI. And I think it's very important, which one wins for a bunch of reasons we could talk about. The open source thing is, of course, super fascinating because it's like throws a wrench into all of this, and it raises a third possibility that like neither the U.S. nor China are going to be the platform. It may just be it's going to be open source. Of course, this is what happened specifically in Unix in operating systems. And then to some extent in databases, and of course, the web was open source. And so there are a whole bunch of software markets in which the outcome has actually been, open source just wins. Like when I was a kid, when I was in the 90s, it was like there was this operating system war between HP and IBM and Solar Graphics and Sun and all these companies to make proprietary Unix, and everybody was making a lot of money on proprietary Unix. And then Linux was a asteroid strike that just completely eliminated all profit and revenue in that industry. And the world benefited, by the way, from Linux in the fact that like everything runs on Linux, and it's been a huge turbo boost to every other aspect of the industry. So it's entirely possible that happens. And then you go back to the 2x2, which is US open source, China open source. The most amazing thing that's happened is China basically pursuing the open source model as aggressively as they are. And there's a lot of theories as to kind of what China's doing here. As far as I can tell, DeepSeek was a surprise to kind of China Inc. Like it was not an anointed sort of Chinese industrial, kind of national champion. It was this hedge fund where the founder basically decided to his enormous credit, decided to have his engineers, build the DeepSeek AI. And so that came out of left field, and that came out of left field for the U.S., but I think it also came out of left field in China. And then it caused a bunch of the other Chinese companies like Kimi and, by the way, Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent and a bunch of these others to basically, it started this like race in China to like win open source. And then look, there's also American open source AI. And so there is this new race underway, from both sides. And it's another thing where I think like how this plays out is going to matter a lot. It's extraordinarily hard to predict. Yeah. I think the people in the big AI labs think that open source can't possibly keep up because of the cost involved. Having said that, again, at least so far, up until like this week, you just say that like whatever the American big labs do, like China figures out a way to do it in open source form.
But they haven't been able to figure out a way to do it 10x better because what they're doing is letting American labs invest and then just distilling the models to some degree.
So I think it's more that there is this distillation, and so yeah.
And there's infrastructure optimization and a bunch of stuff.
There's for sure distillation. So there's this thing distillation where you basically train the next model on the answers of the previous model, and I think for sure China is doing some of that. And there's a lens on that says, of course, that's unfair because you're basically piggybacking on top of work other people have done. Look, having said that, it's a little bit like, well, okay, there's a fair amount of distillation happening in the U.S. also, right? Because distillation, all you need is just be able to ask another AI questions and train on the answers. And then, of course, the AIs themselves are distillations of other content, right? Including a lot of published content. And so, by the way, like you're not saying this, but if someone were to say to me that China is somehow not getting good results from their program because of using distillation, I think that's not.
I think they deserve a lot of credit. Yeah, absolutely.
And then to your point, they're also really good at least so far, they're really good at optimizing, which means that the thing that you think is going to cost $1 gazillion to run, DeepSeek comes out and you can run DeepSeek on home PCs.
And that optimization is happening largely because of necessity, because of a scarcity of the fastest infrastructure that they have available to them.
Yeah, so in Venture, Don Valentine had this old rule of thumb. He said more startups die of indigestion than starvation, in terms of the amount of money you put in. And his point was like scarcity does spark ingenuity.
Yeah.
And so yeah, if you can't get the leading edge chips, you figure out how to hyper optimize the older ones. And again, like, by the way, I'm like, this all makes me like tremendously excited by this entire space because it basically says like right now it's all. Everybody's trying to do their best. Like America's trying to do their best, China's trying to do their best. I definitely want America to win, but China's definitely doing their best. And then the open source thing is working. And then the other part, like on the value chain aspect, is open source doesn't have to win in order to basically remove a profit pool, right?
That's right. That's right.
And so, which is what happened originally with Unix. And so, even if open source just has the effect not of winning, but of keeping the pricing down. Yeah. That will be bad for the proprietary lab providers, but that will be good for everybody else, right? Because it'll make which is what's happening right now. Basically, and if you chart the prices, if you chart the prices of like a model quality, price per model quality, when an open source release comes out, even if it doesn't get significant market share, the price
just goes down.
The price of that model drops to the inference cost of running the open source alternative. So
now, in all the things that you're exposed to, what's the thing that's blown your mind invention-wise and said, oh, wow, this is so cool. It's completely kind of made you rethink your mental model.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's like 6 of those a week right now.
Give us a few.
Yeah, it's incredible. The capability of the voice UIs, I think is unbelievable, and particularly the ones where it's like it's true, full duplex where it really does like you can like interact.
It's like what Maddie's doing with 11 Labs.
Yeah. It's just like I think that's just absolutely amazing. Multimodal, the fact that you can actually talk to in like I think both ChatGPT and Grok have this where. You can turn on your phone camera and you can be pointing at, it's like, what do you think of my interior decorating? And it will comprehensively like deconstruct how bad of a job you've done because it can see your living room, right? Or anything else. By the way, again, immediate medical applications, I have this, thing on my skin, like it immediately, it's able to see it. Like that I think is spectacular. In the last week, there's this new thing. There's these agents now like Claude Code that, and there's this thing called OpenClaw that's an open source agent, and they're amazing. And then there's this thing called Moltbook, which is basically Facebook for AI agents.
Do you think Moltbook has like a 3-week shelf life, or do you think that this thing is has consequential kind of implication on how we think about agents?
So Moltbook, M-O-L-T-B-O-O-K. So Moltbook it's basically it's a social network. It's like Facebook. It's a social network, but for AI agents to talk to each other. It's sort of amazing what's happening. It's highly likely that a significant, it'll blow your mind when you read like the top posts on it because AI agents talking about all kinds of things. Now, a fair amount of the stuff on it is probably human written, like sock puppet, human written for people being funny. It's actually really, really amazing. Like all of the science fiction novels basically have AI either being like super utopian or super dystopian, but they never have this incredible sense of humor aspect, which is what we're actually getting, where people are just using everything as a fodder for memes. And so Moltbook is like saturated with all of these like incredibly funny memes. It's actually quite unclear which ones are real and which ones aren't. The current version of this is somebody wrote an adjacent service from Moltbook called rentahuman.com, which is a labor marketplace for the AI agents on Moltbook to be able to hire human beings to go out. And there's an AI agent on Moltbook that has decided to create an AI religion, and at least as of today, it had hired a single human worker to walk the streets of San Francisco and proselytize the new AI religion. Somebody needs to tell the AI agent in San Francisco that doesn't exactly stand out. You need to go a lot more extreme than that. Like, is this real? Is this not real? As I torture my friends with this, it's like, is it real? Is it not real? It doesn't even really matter. Like these ideas are now like in the air, right? And then by the way, the thing that's happening is that the AI models are now being trained on this content.
That's right.
Right. And so even if this AI model. Even if the current version of like Claude Code doesn't want to start a religion, the next one is going to want to because it's trained on transcripts of discussions of starting new AI religions. And so there's this like incredible feedback loop that's happening where the level of creativity in the space is absolutely. And
the volume's going to balloon up just automatically because of the speed at which it's generating content. What do you worry about the most right now?
I mean, I know you guys talked a lot about regulation on the last panel, Chuck, and Ann. So, I mean, the biggest concern right now, you guys talked about it. I think the regulatory landscape is fairly scary. We were headed in a very bad direction. Unfortunately, it's not a partisan
As an over-regulation.
We were headed in up until in the last administration, we were headed towards extreme over-regulation, for sure, and up to and including possibly full outlawing of the technology, which is very spooky. In the new world, things are better on that front. But what's happened is the action in the U.S. has now shifted to the states. And so there's now thousands of AI bills in the states, which are all, and many of them are actually quite scary. And so it's become kind of a cause célèbre for politicians in both parties to kind of go after. And so that's fairly scary. We'll have to see what happens on that. The situation in Europe is quite alarming. You know, there's a number of European countries that are, you know, really trying hard now to kneecap, you know, I would say American technology, but more generally technology. And then they're getting very kind of worked up about AI. And then, yeah, look, you know, the other is China, you know, the geopolitical aspect, which is China's in the race. And this is better, I would say, what I'm about to say is much better understood today than it was 2 years ago. But 2 years ago, I was getting very alarmed because I would go to Washington and I would have two totally different conversations with regulators, politicians. One was a conversation of what are we going to do in the US, and I would be horrified by the proposals that they were making. And then the other was, oh, well, what if China wins instead? And then everybody would kind of switch positions to say, well, of course, that would be even worse. And so therefore, we need to have like really smart policy in the US. And so, but then, you know, they didn't ever really reconcile those two different perspectives. I think currently, and actually I'd say in people, some people in both parties for sure are, I think, thinking about this much more clearly now. And so, you know, there's in the U.S. there's some improvement on the margin, but you know, China's on it, and you know, China, and you know, just like we saw with 5G and Huawei, like China has advantages. You know, we have advantages, but China definitely.
Who's winning right now?
I mean, right, look, the new advances in capabilities at the chip level and at the model level and at the app level are coming, you know, mostly from the U.S. And so if it's a foot race, you know, we're ahead by a bit. But when everything that happens then, you know, has a version that comes out, you know, 2 months later that's either free or, you know, a third the cost or something, that's like right. You know, that's a challenge. And then, you know, China is for sure innovating, and so nothing to prevent them from.
It could be a business model disruption rather than an economic disruption, or rather than just you know, technological disruption.
Yeah, exactly. And then you know, this even comes up with like chip policy, and you know, we're not really active in chips that much, but you know, there's this argument. It goes back to what you said about China optimizing because if they can't get access to the advanced chips. There's an argument on the policy side to hold back on, you know, basically prevent export of cutting edge American AI chips to China, to deny them those capabilities. But on the other side of that, there's an argument that if you do that, you then motivate them more to create their own chip ecosystem, which they are definitely doing, right? And so and they have a whole national program to build up a, you know, competitive chip industry, and then ultimately, you know, leapfrog us. And so that's a really big deal. And then to kind of go back to earlier topic, like, if the world runs an American AI, like, the world may not be perfect, but like generally speaking, you know, or America may not be perfect, but like generally speaking, the AI is going to be, you know,
IP will be respected, privacy will be protected. You know, you'll have.
It'll have the values that we're used to.
Yeah.
If the world runs on Chinese AI, not so much. You can actually see this today. So when like DeepSeek and these companies put out their AI models, you know, they put out this paper where they show all these, you know, American companies do this too. They run all these tests to try to figure out how good the model is. And China has, you know, these additional kind of line items for the test, which is, you know, Marxism, and then, you know, Xi Jinping thought, right? And it turns out the Chinese models are really good at Marxism and Xi Jinping thought. And, you know, I don't know about you, but I want my grandkids educated by the other kind of model.
The other kind of model.
Yeah.
I wish we had another 45 minutes to go through with you. Will you come back?
Yes, 100%.
Awesome.
Yep, good.
Marc Andreessen.
Good. Thanks, folks.
Thanks so much.